Okay. We have today as our guest someone I am just delighted to have. Matthias Waschek became the director of the Worcester Art Museum in November 2011. Prior to that, he served as head of academic programs at the Louvre in Paris from 1992 to 2003, and as executive director and curator of the Pulitzer Foundation for the Arts from 2003 to 2011. We'll be talking a great deal today about the role of cultural institutions in our market-driven age, and I can't think of a better guest than Matthias Waschek. He is widely respected for his innovative programs and exhibitions, as well as his talent for establishing robust strategic partnerships with community stakeholders and businesses. During his tenure at the Pulitzer Foundation, he shaped the identity of the foundation as a young and experimental institution with a strong community impact by clarifying its mission as a, quote, laboratory and a sanctuary. He built a stable organization and financial structure to ensure long-term strength and sustainability. In order to raise the foundation's institutional profile and impact, he grew the annual operating budget by 52% over 6 years. We'll be talking with him about how I can do that as well. Throughout his museum career, Dr. Waschek has generated numerous collaborations between universities and museums to develop experimental programs, such as a partnership between the Pulitzer Foundation and the George Warren Brown School of Social Work at Washington University in St. Louis. Dr. Waschek hopes to make the museum an urban player in Worcester, strengthening an already existing culture of creativity, innovation, and cohesion. His goal is to maximize the museum's regional impact, to engage the local community, including more than 30,000 college students, and to make the institution organizationally and financially more sustainable for the next chapter of its growth. Please join me in welcoming Matthias Waschek. Thank you.
Well, it's quite an honor to have the last word for your course, so I hope I'll be at the level for this. Museum director is not just me, but everybody else heading a place of medium size like the Worcester Art Museum, or even bigger like the MFA. We have to think, I mean, it's always about the art and about visitors, but we have to think about funding, for instance. How do we get the funding for what? For a mission that we need to shape. How do we reach the audiences that make our institution relevant, and so on and so forth? How do we even develop a very specific narrative for our institution, our respective ones? In certain cases, if it's Davenport in the Midwest, in Iowa, you don't have competitors around you. In the case of New England, it's a very dense cultural landscape. And so you have to think about how you define your institution as unique or as an alternative to other institutions. So lots of questions from where you can look at the museum. What I would like to do today is to look at art as an all-pervading principle, something that is enshrined in our vision statement, one of the first things that I wrote with the board for the Worcester Art Museum. And the art as an all-pervading principle is not just the pleasure of a director who happens to like art, or of a board that happens to like art. It is something that is meant to allow us to reach funding streams. It is something that is meant to allow us to reach audiences and to put a museum that for quite some time has only mildly been on the map, to put our institution on the map. So all these thoughts are not as blue-eyed or as lofty as they sound. The proof is in the pudding, and the proof is that ultimately our museum will be a force to be reckoned with, not just within Worcester, but within a broader region. Talking about design, I'll make a little incursion. None of you knows the name of a German romantic, Karl Philipp Moritz. He was born in the middle of the 18th century and died in the 1830s. He made a trip to Rome and wrote back to his friends, among them Goethe, that he was so impressed by what he saw, and he felt that his way of describing it needed to be on the same level as the art that he saw. He became one of the first professors of art history in Berlin, the cradle of art history as an academic discipline. And he and other romantics kept thinking, what is the most adequate way of thinking about art, describing it, analyzing it, that is as close as possible to art? Seems like an esoteric problem, but when you translate this into the reality of a museum, how can you, in the most impactful way, in the most congenial way, present art where the act of presentation is actually art already, rather than a mere administrative endeavor? What you're seeing up here, and I'm going to another photograph, is an attempt. This was one of the first things that my colleagues and I did in Worcester, to approach that question. How do you present art, and at the same time what you're doing is at least congenial with art? So what you see there is the chapter house at the Worcester Art Museum. The chapter house predates the cloisters, which some of you may know in New York City, by 6 or 7 years. So there was a director of the Worcester Art Museum who went to New York and saw a pile of stones coming from somewhere in France. It was an entire chapter house from a monastery. And he said, I think we should have that in Worcester. And so the stones were brought to Worcester and were incorporated into a new building project that ultimately opened in 1933. So we have this chapter house, and what do you do with an architecture that in itself is the object? But as a visitor, you enter, you look around, and then you leave again. The connection is actually minimal. So chapter houses, just a little further background information, chapter houses were in monasteries the place for secular conversations. So the monks or nuns did not pray. They had secular conversations with farmers because there were feudal lords and so on and so forth. So the furniture that we commissioned from a designer team in Munich, Crowd Design, was furniture that should actually invite people, firstly, to sit and to experience the space in a congenial way. When you enter that space and you look at the groupings of these chairs, it looks almost like ghosts of conversations that once happened. And once you sit down, you're part of that conversation. We also added layers of programming like storytelling, and kids love to sit in these different configurations on the chairs to actually activate the space that before was used mainly for wedding ceremonies. It was very popular and still is, but no time could you find a visitor who would stay. And here you come already to a first criteria of what design should do. It should invite people to stay in a space rather than rush through. So this is just setting the stage for a broader thinking about the Worcester Art Museum as a typical museum in this part of the world. So this is our first building, which opened in 1898. It was what one calls in Europe the Temple of the Muses, a building that shouted history, history, history. In Europe, people really pigged out on staircases, were gigantic staircases leading up. In Vienna, you see this. In Berlin, you see this. In every major city in Europe, you had to enter via gigantic staircases to finally meet the muses and be in adoration in front of art of all times. In our case, the staircases are relatively modest, but the building still shouts education and art, and we tell you how you have to perceive this art. How does it look inside? This is the way it looked inside our museum. So the museum started with plaster casts and had lots of showcases. It almost looks like a kind of a cabinet either of a curiosity collector, or it could be a very crowded natural science collection. And this was the way that the design went, that the design was conceived to attract the imagination of the visitors. Those days, the main constituency of the Worcester Art Museum were the locals and people in central Massachusetts. Visitation those days went, in certain peak years, up to 200,000 a year. So that concept probably was a very successful one. People were very proud of the museum, of a city that was an industrial city. That museum was the sanctuary of works that were not mass-produced, that came from the pre-industrial era. In addition to that, you could take courses in that museum to copy sculpture and things like that. You could get a kind of decent artistic education, and a lot of middle-class families took advantage of that. So that's the way it looked at its inception, and a lot of American museums looked exactly like that. And a lot of American museums actually started as collections of plaster casts until the dollar went more and more solid, and the European currencies went further and further down. And then industrialists from all over America went on shopping sprees across the globe and filled these spaces with more and more prestigious artwork. So that's the first chapter for the Worcester Art Museum, but for a lot of other museums too. This is the entrance, kind of pixelated, I do apologize for that. I'll give you a better image in a second. For our building that opened in 1933, and that included the chapter house, and I'll give you a better image here. You see on the ground floor illuminated the outside facade of our chapter house, which, as I said, was bought in 27 and showed to the visitors the very moment this building opened. We had something like 250,000 visitors at that point in 1933. Which is quite surprising at a time where mobility is not as developed as it is now, and where people were more parochial and more looking to their city. So a lot of people from Worcester went, and probably some of them went twice or three times to get the numbers up to 250,000. So what you see here, what's the design in this case? In this case, the design is a Hollywoodian film set to enact the past. So this is a Renaissance court. Those of you who went to the Harvard Art Museums, there's a Renaissance court as well. They were being a little bit more puritanical because they avoided a flamboyant staircase. Here in Worcester, we didn't. We wanted to have a big staircase to be bigger than Harvard. Harvard was some years before, that building opened some years before us. And to really create this phenomenal dream of the past. So when you left the industrial reality of the city of Worcester behind you, and you entered that court, you were in a world where history was intact. There were no problems, there were just beautiful art, and you could look at it in a very formalist way and have a wonderful day. And a lot of people liked that, that experience. And then things changed. Worcester reached its peak in, helped by World War II and the armament industry. Most of the helmets, for instance, that were used against my dear fellow countrymen in World War I and II were produced in Worcester. And the manufacturing wealth was melting away. And also the financial resources that actually financed first this curiosity cabinet presentation and the finances that paid for the Hollywoodian dream in an industrialist city. So the next push was to go modern. And going modern in this case was to ask an architecture firm from Boston, the Architects Collaborative, to build us a fabulous education wing in the language that became very fashionable then of brutalism. So Boston had its brutalist town hall. Worcester had already a town hall and couldn't afford to do away with it, so at least we wanted to have a brutalist addition to our museum, which was kind of the description of the identity of Worcester, or who Worcester wants to be, or who the oligarchs, if you will, or the industrial captains wanted the city to be or to aspire to. So this wing opened in 1970, was dedicated to education on steroids. Before education had been in the basement of the building and then went to a building across the road. The ratio between studio art classes in terms of real estate and gallery spaces is something that no other museum in America has. So it's, I think the studio art classes are something like the equivalent of a third of our gallery space. That's quite enormous. And you need quite some money to run that. And the hope was that this money, because from the 70s onwards, a lot of people were very much interested in education, would come. That money did not come. So that concept was kind of in limbo for quite some time. Here's a view of our complex. To the left, that's the 1930s building. Behind it, you have the remaining core of the initial building. And then on the right, you see wrapping around the Higgins wing, this brutalist addition to the Worcester Art Museum. What saved the museum for quite some time was a gift that the industrialists have put into the cradle of the museum when they sold off their assets, and that gift was an endowment. Museums need endowments to live because the business model of a museum is actually kind of lopsided. That endowment, which reached before the bottom fell out in 2008, $110 million, gave the museum a runway to rethink itself. It didn't really happen, that thinking process. It was much more the museum in that configuration was actually a tool to have at least one place in a fast-changing society to say, actually, things haven't changed that much. This museum is the guarantor of good old values. But what also happened due to the lack of resources was there were various crises requesting capital campaigns. The last capital campaign was hampered by 2008. And overnight, our endowment was reduced to almost half. We ended up with $65 million, I think. And the earned income, which does help the operational budget, couldn't compensate for this, and the raised income couldn't compensate for this either. The funding basically had melted away. And at that moment, the board made a very bold decision. They said, we absolutely need change. What that change is, we don't know, but we need change. There was a search process, and I happened to be the lucky one to get that position. And one of the reasons why the search committee liked my application was that I have a double background. On the one hand, connecting to the community, what I did in St. Louis, but on the other hand, a kind of international level, so that it's not dumbing something down, but it's combining on a high level community engagement with abiding by national, if not international, standards whilst you do that. So we were looking at this campus with a lot of deferred maintenance. The elevators are not up to standard. Restrooms are a joke. The building is not really accessible in the way that modern art institutions want to be or should be accessible. So this was actually, on the one hand, you think, my God, this is almost a task that nobody can do when you don't know how to grow your donor base. On the other hand, it's actually an interesting proposition. The Worcester Art Museum has never gone through these big rebuilding campaigns that a lot of museums have in this country, so a lot of mistakes were not made. We were actually in our juice. So one big mistake is to have a gigantic hall with lots of glass, and you need, I don't know how many hundred thousands to heat and cool it over the year. That's a mistake, because that money you'd rather put into serving your audiences. So these mistakes were never made. So how do we rethink this campus and maybe keep some of the quirkiness of the Worcester Art Museum? And how do we find the funders to think afresh with us about that institution? Here comes an architecture team that I know from my time in St. Louis. Why architecture? The principal is Kulapat Yantrasast. He's Thai. He made his way into to Japan, studied architecture there, and became a member of the studio of Tadao Ando. Tadao Ando, I don't know if the name rings a bell to you. Tadao Ando just did the finishing touches on the Clark Art Museum in Williamstown. Ando did the Contemporary Art Museum in Fort Worth. But he also did, and that's how I was connected, he also built the Pulitzer Foundation for the Arts in St. Louis, which is one of the most beautiful contemporary buildings I've ever seen. And Kulapat was a little bit the ambassador of Tadao Ando on Earth. Ando used very wisely, uncannily, his supposed incapacity to speak English, and he always had other people to say no for him. And when he said yes, he just nodded. And when he didn't want to understand, he simply didn't understand. So it's a good technique that he was using there. Anyways, Kulapat was amazingly creative in whatever question we had. And so I had a conversation with him and I said, listen, we have no money, but we could be a hub of great ideas, and it is with these great ideas that we're coming up with that I hope to connect us to funders who want to make a difference in an institution that has a phenomenal collection, but right now not the carburant, means money, where they cannot make a difference anymore in institutions that went through the cycle of rebuilding. So he came and he used a word that I liked very much, acupuncture. So instead of thinking of pulling down parts of the building or making gigantic annexes, he said, let's just activate parts of the building that we can, and then go slowly, slowly, slowly. So build a campus master plan, but then actually go in little increments forward. And this is the tactique, if you will, that we are adopting. Again, the proof will be if we do find the funders or not. One of the things that I need to do now is to expand our board, which currently has 20 members, and we will look at 30 board members. And we're looking at board members that are between the Worcester Art Museum and Boston. So people that could actually be stakeholders in an endeavor like ours. So this idea of a sanctuary and a lab is the same thing. This is the laboratory for a museum, a highly inventive museum in the 21st century, if we are successful. Otherwise, it's just falling flat, and you will not invite me the next time. So, Kulapat came with the, so we were looking at various parts of our building, and we thought, let's just have a little bit of what-if thinking before the big master plan is taking off. And he was playing with our front, this 1933 facade. And one of the things that was the motor for thinking that was an access that is all-inclusive and yet a work of art. So we have these stairs leading up to the main entrance and then to the Renaissance Court, which I showed you a little bit earlier. And people who have disabilities are not able to enter the museum that way. But it's not just people with disabilities, it's also families with strollers whom we want to attract. Can't enter the building that way. And we also have an aging population, not just in Massachusetts, but all over the post-industrial world. So some of them, core constituency of the museum, will choose, and are choosing already, not to use stairs to enter the institution. So let's take the bull by the horns and come up with a universal access bridge, which we have broken ground for. We got the funding for. And we went through quite some motions, historical commissions. I didn't know that Massachusetts was even more complicated than Europe. We had to appeal to 2 historical committees to get through. But we did. So what that bridge does is it makes, well, firstly, it is both complementary to the architecture, using similar material. I mean, the bronze, for instance, of the fins is the same material as that of the windows and that of the railings. It's only not yet oxidized. But it's also a very modern statement, and it is an inclusive statement. And access is one of the important things for museums, particularly because cultural habits have changed and the desire of accessibility has shifted. So it's both symbolic and pragmatic, a gesture. That's at night. The entrance to our building. We're also looking to our sides, the Lancaster front. This is here again the entrance of the... So what we were struggling with was these damn stairs. Not only are they damn stairs because they do not allow an all-inclusive entrance, they're damn stairs because a lot of shortcuts were made when they were built just 10 years ago, so it's all crumbling. Another problem that we were dealing with was that brutalism is rarely transparent. So the museum looked even more like a fortress than the Salisbury facade. So acupuncture in that case was the sledgehammer and open up a window so that people who are driving by see light and see people. Also, the planning for this has evolved tremendously. We are, once we find the funding, we're covering the stairs and just have a ramp going up to that side of the building. Something else happened, and that was last year. A very beloved institution in Worcester, the Higgins Armory Museum, closed. Mr. Higgins was the very gentleman who produced all these nice little helmets to protect you guys. So the museum closed because they didn't have the endowment. They were over-reliant on earned income. And a week before I started my position, which was in 2011, in November 2011, I already had to sit down with the board president of that institution and the interim director to think about getting the Higgins to the Worcester Art Museum. And initially, I mean, it was just overwhelming. The institution had no money, had lost a little bit its way, and then think on top of that to integrate the Higgins, that's a big thing. What happened was that we all agreed that the Higgins could actually be a game changer for our institution because they were able to reach family audiences with kids. And they could thereby completely change our institutional DNA. So what you're seeing there are 2 views of the same space. The left is the way the lobby inside the museum looked until I arrived, or until the Higgins hit us, so to speak. And on the right you see how that space looks now, and here the narrative is yet another one. It is, to a certain point, Hollywood, or would be, I don't know, Petrograd wood, because the film sequence that you see is Ivan the Terrible by Eisenstein. But it is connecting people to stories. Arms and Armor are actually connectors to stories. This hall had various aspects to get people into the tune of that new way of thinking about the museum. So instead of teaching art history, connecting with stories where art history may have a role, if people are so inclined, but it's not us who are telling people what they have to be interested in. So you have that pink horse, which also challenges certain gender ideas, because Arms and Armor are very male-dominated, and we didn't have a statue of Joan of Arc. So this is where everything starts, and then from there onwards, people are going into the Nights exhibition, which is a temporary exhibition for the next 4 years until Arms and Armour goes into the final galleries. But it's also the starting point of rethinking the entire museum as a place that tells stories, stories that are relevant to our audiences, stories that make our audiences linger in the museum, stay in the museum, because that's a goal. The very moment you have this kind of track record and get people enthusiastic about this new concept, old concept, the funding will be easier. And we have seen already a change in terms of board building and in terms of finding funders. There's also a very pragmatic thing. So in our budget, we have $20 million endowment, and endowment has 5%. Normally you get 5% of the endowment. $20 million reserved for capital projects. Our capital projects are so enormous. As I said, elevators are kind of problematic. The whole circulation in the building is problematic. Staircases are problematic. Restrooms are problematic. So what if one combined two funding streams, actually, to get the restrooms up to speed, to get the elevators up to speed, and to make out of the museum, as I said initially, an artistic statement. And that is what we are after. So just imagine, I don't know, did any of you go to the Bob Gober exhibition at MoMA? Bob Gober is an artist who is fascinated by the act of uncleanliness, or by being unclean, by the need to wash yourself. So give Bob Gober, we can't do this, he will be far too expensive, but an artist like him, give Bob Gober the design for our restrooms and make out of the restrooms actually an artistic statement. Kiki Smith, that's puritanical angst, ask her to do the women's restrooms. So think also in a different way about the restroom, that the restroom is not just an ancillary service, but it is actually part of the museum experience. Elevators. I just come up with an idea just to I mean, there's a video by Andy Warhol of, I think it's the Empire State Building, with the lights going on and off. If you have that video in the elevator, already your experience of using that damn thing is a very different one. If you have a sound piece in that elevator, and if you use the design, can be even an installation in the elevator, the design for that, and use capital improvement at the same time, you're actually in a good place. So this is the way we're thinking right now. I think my time is running out. It's 27, 10, 11 seconds. I was only supposed to speak 25, I think. But this is the way we are thinking right now to put the Worcester Art Museum on the map, and putting an institution on the map means to find the funding and to connect with audiences, but also with donors. Donors, and it's a very interesting thing. When you look at certain museums and at their new additions, and you look at the donors, it is such a logical match. So what a museum director and a development department and the senior staff of a museum has to do is to work synergetically with donors. First of all, find them, and then work synergetically with them, so that the result is not just driven by a certain idea of impact by these specific donors. And I cannot go into detail, obviously, because I'm on camera, you told me that. But just look at what kind of corporations are involved in financing new wings of institutions. Voila.
Why don't you sit right here? Well, fantastic. As I told you before, I have been hoping to get museum director as our guest, and I couldn't be happier that it's you, because you are clearly reimagining the Worcester Art Museum, and you've laid out for us the complex, knotty situation that it finds itself in terms of physical resources, buildings, and audiences. I liked very much the way you addressed this towards the end, and it struck me with the elevators, the restrooms, and the staircases, really redefining the problem to be solved. This is something that we've talked a lot about in this course. We talk a great deal about empathy, understanding your audience, but then understanding and defining the problem to be solved. I wonder if you want to just say a little bit more about that.
I think design, in that case, the artist becomes a co-designer, and the process is a very complex one, because there are also egos that you have to work with, is the design that we are after is a very different one from just having nice little illustrations on the tiles in the restroom, because it doesn't rethink going to the restroom.
Right.
Let's take a less, a less complex subject. Let's just take seating.
Right.
If you go to Smith College in Northampton, they asked artists to carve benches. It didn't address the seating.
Right.
It just gave benches a prettier face, arguably, yes or no.
Right.
The way we address that question with seating in the image that I showed you at the very beginning was to think about seating as an act of social interaction. Right. So it's a very different way of thinking about that seating. And the restrooms would need to be rethought in that way as well. I mean, there are basic functions. You need to have plumbing.
Sure.
How family restrooms would be yet another question to answer. How do you make it for kids fun to go to a restroom like that? And still make them understand, well, this is also part of an art museum, rather than just having Blanche-Neige and the Seven Gnomes painted on the tiles.
Right.
So what is it that you need to do? And so there is where the artistic energy comes and gives a more interesting framework. Yeah. Ultimately, if we're successful with these bathrooms, people will go to the bathrooms even though they don't need to, and have the most wonderful museum experience.
Right. Well, the idea of you probably overheard me speaking to the students at the outset of the class. They're doing an experience map right now of any. They can choose any experience, a shopping, a website, whatever, a museum. But one of the things that you are doing is breaking apart or let's say disaggregating the museum experience so that you can reimagine each step of it along the way, the entry sequence, the way you approach from one entry versus another, how you navigate the accessibility issue. I think that's essential to being creative in this kind of context. If you just looked at, as you defined it, your problem when you took this job was unsolvable through one lens, right? It's just too big. The resources, problems to be solved, there's no match there. So one must go in and reimagine that.
And it's the way of thinking, it's linear versus associative, analytic versus synthetic thinking. Ultimately, what we are looking at is something that is synergistic, so that the different parts are actually working together to create something new, rather than, and that's the traditional way of thinking, analytic, that you just separate every issue and treat it as an issue in its own right. It's all about museum, it's all about art, it's all about audiences, it's all about everything.
Right. Well, that reminds me about the question of who the audience is, because it seems to me that's something you have really quite actively thought about. You are not just saying, well, whoever was coming to the Worcester Art Museum before I started, that's my audience. You're clearly trying to actively cultivate different audiences through the armory business, but also maybe you want to talk a bit about that, because that sounds very interesting to me.
again, various, you have to bear with me. My thoughts are also meandering in the same way
Sure.
that what I'm preaching. The core audiences of museums is a educated middle class, and it's a certain age very often. Mm-hmm. That core audience is not sufficient in the city of Worcester, which does not benefit from tourism, to keep the museum going.
Right.
So there is an interesting model, which is that of science museums. Mm-hmm. So where museums like the Worcester Art Museum have declining visitation, science museums actually are skyrocketing. I mean, it's amazing to see. And this is also because it's spaces that tell stories, and where you have something that doesn't make you feel you don't know enough, but makes you feel you want to know more. Right, you want to experience more. Right. So that sets a template, and I can't go into detail, and the specialist sits over there. It's Adam Rozan, our Director of Audience Engagement. Then, with the Higgins Armory, the Higgins was able to attract school classes, to attract kids who said to their parents, we want to go to that place. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I stop crying if you get me there. So, our museum needs to change radically to translate the audiences that the Higgins was able to attract to our museum. Right. Because at the moment there's this barrier of an art museum that tells you what you don't know and makes you feel like this, and makes you feel inadequate. Yeah. So how do we get people across the threshold? How do we get people to come again and again to the institution? Right.
Well, I think that, the way you just framed that is transformative. I hadn't really thought about science museum versus art museum in this way, but you're right. Science museums are always telling a story. I've known some people who have been very active in museum and exhibit design, and the narrative necessary to explain something like how whales hear, or you know what I mean? and so by necessity, they don't just show a picture of a whale, or even maybe even of the sounds that a whale might hear. They really explain why this is interesting, step by step. So you leave knowing more than you did going in, rather than the opposite, as you say, my goodness, how few art history classes you took, right? I think that's really interesting, and it does seem to me, even though the situation is perhaps more focused in Worcester, it does seem to me that we're talking about how cultural institutions in the United States, in the West, in market-driven economies, have to transform, I would say, across the board. I mean, there are very few exceptions, no?
Well, there are museums that have tourism. Mm-hmm. So MoMA, the Louvre, when I left the Louvre, it had 3 million, now it has 9 million visitors, which creates the opposite problem. How do you allow this big amount, this gigantic amount of people to still have a good experience of the place? But I think the world is, the dividing line is museums in places that have tourism, as opposed to museums in places that don't.
Yes, great point.
So we are in the same situation as the Art Center in Des Moines, Iowa, St. Louis Art Museum. We are not in the same situation as the MFA or the Met.
That's a very good distinction.
And so we cannot, we need the repeat visitor. There's an ethical thing that every museum says, we need the repeat visitor, but ultimately, the Louvre doesn't need the repeat visitor. They just keep coming. They may be disappointed, but then there are more that are coming after them. So it's quite okay.
Well, from a design standpoint, the Louvre is a great little case study. And let's just talk about it for a second, because you're so familiar with it. I would say the genius of the complete transformation of the Louvre by IMP is the recognition of what you just said, that this is basically, for years, how many of you have been to the Louvre in Paris? All right, pretty well-traveled bunch. Before IMP designed the incredible, massive underground concourse connected directly to the metro.
And to shopping mall.
And to shopping mall. There were different entrances scattered all over the Louvre complex. Very hard to, very little sense of the whole thing as an enterprise. It was built over time. But the genius of this was to recognize that, in fact, what the addition or transformation, to call it an addition, is the transformation of the Louvre was really about inserting the building type of the airport into the building type of the museum. And suddenly, 3 to 9 million visitors is actually the core mission, managing all those people in the shopping mall and the circulation routes and the transportation and the parking, et cetera. Wow. I mean, as soon as you look at it that way, and it's not just people look at it and they say, oh, you mean the thing with the pyramid skylight? Yes, that is an aspect of it, but that's not the thing. The thing is integrating those two building types, which is really interesting because it's defining the problem as what it really is. It's not an aesthetic problem. It's a circulation problem.
Yes, very much so. Yeah. And so whenever you work with architects and you rethink your institution, one of the first things that comes up is that of circulation, actually.
Yeah. Well, that's super interesting, and I appreciate very much the distinction between the two types of conditions that museums find themselves in, either as a destination themselves, or like in a part of a menu of touristic activities in a city that people go to already, versus having to make themselves a destination. And Massachusetts, when you think about it, has an inordinate number of major museums. I don't know, I mean, I'm sure New York State has as many, but my gosh, per capita, there have to be more significant museums here than anywhere. I don't know. How many of you have been to Western Massachusetts to Mass MoCA? Wow. You should go. All right.
Yeah,
it's really close by.
And it's fantastic.
It's fantastic, and it's about to expand again. Mm-hmm. You know, between the Gardner, the MFA, the Peabody Essex, and the ICA, by my count in the last 10 years, or thereabouts, Boston and environs will have spent something like $1.5 billion on museum upgrades. This is not a small enterprise.
Definitely not.
And
the other thing is, you need, via these upgrades, create a narrative that attracts people. So the narrative that the MFA in Boston, around the corner, has, if we are the same, but only with a fraction of their collection, why bother going to Worcester?
Right.
Let's rather go to the MFA.
Right.
But if we have a story to tell and an experience to offer that the MFA is not able to offer due to its size and due to its being anchored in the 19th century, much more than the Worcester Art Museum is, then we are actually in a good place. So we are looking, we're looking at zip codes. And because we had quite some marketing money for the opening of the Nights exhibition, and we looked at the zip codes where our visitation is from. Obviously, the lion's share is from central Massachusetts. But then the two counties between us and Boston, it's Norfolk and Middlesex, I think, they carry quite some burden. So if we are able to reach via the schools, via faith communities, via so many other things, to these areas, then we potentially have an agglomeration of 2 million people.
Right.
But we can only reach there, not because we say we want to reach you guys, but we can only reach there if we have a story to offer.
That's it.
That is so different from what the MFA does on a phenomenally high level. But we need to be different. Right.
Well, I completely get that. I mean, as someone who started a school here, that is exactly what, you know, we were in the shadow of Harvard and MIT as a perspective architecture program. And believe me, I had no illusions that we were going to suddenly, when we didn't have an architecture program, become a competitor of theirs immediately. So that distinctiveness, I think, is really essential. I'm assuming that part of that distinctiveness, and I'd like to drill into that a little bit, is about the sort of post-industrial reality of a place like Worcester, that was such a significant city in the 19th century from an economic standpoint, and is a different city today. Not to say it isn't significant, but it plays a smaller role, let's say, in the regional economy, I would say, probably.
Yes, I mean, Worcester is now very much in the service industry. So the biggest employer in central Massachusetts is UMass, the medical complex. The next one is Hanover Insurance. And then we have Holy Cross being the biggest employer among the colleges in Worcester. Then we have 30,000 students.
Wow.
Clark is important, and the others are adding to this. So the benefit that we can offer to Worcester, again, if we're successful and if the others are willing, is to make Worcester, now that it is mainly deindustrialized, something like a college town. People at the moment are enrolling in Worcester in spite of the city, rather than because of it. So we're not like Northampton. So the museum also has there a function to play, which the big guys don't think of and don't need to think about, which is the connection of the museum campus to the city.
Right.
You don't go to a museum that's an island. You go to a museum that is part of a fabric.
Right. That's so true.
So we started with WPI and the Worcester Art Museum. We basically share a campus. We jump-started a cultural district, and we may have an art walk going through and things like that. And should we be successful in this endeavor, again, we will be strengthening the northern end of Main Street and help the donut to become less of a donut, ultimately. I mean, it's almost like dominoes everywhere, and it's kind of overwhelming when you think about the totality. But if you do not think about it, you miss out on an important part. What is important is when you have this more holistic thinking, is that you take just little slices and move forward. So your plan is more that, I mean, you still dream big, but you're dreaming in increments rather than in adding a gigantic new wing to the Worcester Art Museum or in accomplishing one gigantic thing. You will never get there. Sometimes you start with the chairs that I showed you at the very beginning of my, so that everybody gets it. And the more people are getting it, the more everybody is aligned. And the conversations are, and the funding are going into one direction.
Well, it's so interesting because in a way this is museum as urban design catalyst, or I won't say the only catalyst, but player, key player, core player in the redevelopment of a portion of the city.
Yes.
How much do you work with city officials on this? Do they have a planning department that is sympathetic to this kind of enterprises, or is this sort of completely ground up?
We're starting to do this. So it's still in its infancy, and I also don't know, I mean, my next step is to reach another 6 million for the Higgins integration.
Yes.
So that there are initial conversations already with people from the city, not with the planning commission itself, but with the city manager, about our need to think about a campus and the difference that we can make. There are conversations with the colleges about this. And I don't know how far we will get. I mean, it's ultimately, it's these little steps that will end somewhere, and if we're lucky, it'll end by solving all the problems, and reality may just allow us to solve 10% of it, and then future generations will add to this.
Well, you know, in the same sense that you are working to try to give the Worcester Art Museum a rebirth, that same animus is at work in post-industrial cities around the Commonwealth and around New England, and frankly around the world. Certainly in Germany it's also true. And we realize, perhaps in retrospect, as we realize most things, that the forces that shape our cities initially, that kind of give them, in Europe is very different here because oftentimes their cities are 500 years old or 800 years old. But here in the US, where oftentimes cities are really not very old, and they've had one period of major economic reason to exist. And if you think about St. Louis or you think about Buffalo, those were super important cities around the year 1900. Now, significantly less so. And the energy required to resurrect the urban fabric of cities that were pretty big, the amount of capital, the amount of intellectual activity, the amount of cultural activity, I think we forget how much that is until we go into a place and have to try to regenerate it. Just ask Detroit.
Absolutely. And then there's another big difference between American cities and European cities. The notion of public space is very different. European cities have public space everywhere, even small cities. I mean, they have the marketplace, and when you go to Italy, everybody meets on the marketplace. Right. There ain't no such thing in American cities. So Worcester has some parks, but people don't meet in anywhere specific. The students may stay on their campus. Right. The adults have maybe gigantic houses, and that's their space, but it's not a public space. Right. So museums can actually play a role in shaping a different notion of a public space. And again, this is this lofty goal. If we get the different steps one after the next right, maybe at one point we'll be reaching this. What you need for the museum to be a public space, you need free entrance. Right. And you need something that makes it worth for people to go there, to benefit from that free entrance.
Well, actually, you know, what are some other cultural institutions that are going through exactly the same thing? Libraries, of course, completely. But museums have museums' task, it seems to me, is more complex. Because at least with libraries, stop me if I make a mistake here, but with libraries, there's one giant change going on, which is the movement to digital publication. And it's a big thing, and it changes the space allocation and use structure of a library, maybe even the function of a library. But it's one big variable. I would argue that in museums, there are more variables, making it a more complex problem. What I mean by that is, you still have, the artifacts are still kind of the same. I mean, they get added to over time, but you're not just going in and scanning all of your sculptures and your paintings and putting them on a website. You know, there's still a place, and there's still physical stuff to maintain. But there is not the same degree, certainly, as there was 100 years ago, of cultural commitment and financial commitment and societal commitment to supporting this through philanthropy. In Europe, it seems to me, the differences are far more fundamental, which is that those cultures were almost all formed and built the core of their cities really before democracy and before the kind of market-driven structure without a public equivalent that we have today. And still Europe is still has much stronger public realm than we have here.
Very much so. Very much so. There are things for museums that are different. Two things. One is our visual culture has changed. All of you are looking every now and then at your iPhones or at your computers. So your visual expectation is a different one from 1 or 2 generations ago. And so when you look at artwork, they are so much at odds, particularly old masters or archaeological artifacts, with the reality of the screen. So how do we we bridge that gap is an important question. The other one is that the definition of museums is a European one and is a definition that presupposes a homogeneous society. Europe, in the same way as America, only America came earlier, has more and more diversity in its population. And the museum almost looks like a white man's sanctuary. And has less and less relevance the more the population in the United States with strong ties to Europe will be in the minority. Has much less impact. And what is interesting to see, particularly in British museums, so British Isles, how they try to bridge that gap, particularly via schools. I went recently to the National Portrait Gallery, so it's an orgy of white man's past. And sometimes shady because there is quite some colonialism and exploitation behind these long wigs. But the way the programs are run, and I didn't go into detail, I didn't have the time, it seems to be almost like, well, this is a heritage that we're passing on to you. We'll do our very best that later on you will take good care of that because it's your heritage too. We haven't been able to do that outside of Britain. And I don't know how successful they are. I've just seen some anecdotes that gave me quite some hope.
Well, this is interesting because, you know, the whole idea of a museum as being about a single narrative seems to me very open to question, and I think many people would agree with that. But there also seems to be a technological evolution that is used already by museums that I'm surprised I don't see more of, and maybe it exists and I'm not aware of it. Oftentimes you go to a museum and they'll have, well, just in the last generation, they've had the audio-video guide. You listen, you know, it tells the story for you in a way. It says, first look at this painting. Okay, this is why Goya did this. And then I go to the next one, and it's in a sequence. It's an intentional narrative. Now, of course, sometimes museums have apps for your phone so you can get the same kind of choreography on your own device. But it seems like there's a great opportunity to have a number of different narratives available. That's a great way to get people to come, return, and stay. That I'm going to have the, you know, first I'm going to have a colonial white male perspective of this part of the Worcester Art Museum, for example, and this is a crude story, but you know, but then alternatively, I'm going to have you know, a female black slave's perspective of the same narrative, or the same museum, very different stops along the way, and I'm going to have something else. It would seem like that would be a really, do museums do that?
They do. I mean, Detroit works in this direction. Brooklyn does too, and other museums do as well, but they were the leaders in the field. We are experimenting right now with iPads as labels, so that people can also write their own labels. But that's at this point more of a pious wish that they're writing their own labels. There needs to be much more context for them to feel confident that their label that they're writing is meaningful. Right. But the interactive part even, it's not just to offer different stories, but to offer a story where you have somewhat of an impact, not just the choice between them, but you can actually also shape that story yourself via your visit. Well,
would it be a good, forgive the unsolicited advice, but would it make sense in a place like Worcester to try to fold in the city as you are doing physically, but to try to, what better way to get me into the museum than have it be part of a narrative that is, you know, in Boston we have the Freedom Trail.
Yeah.
Are there multiple routes through Worcester, each of which could include a visit and part of the collection at Worcester? I'm just thinking, is there a way to contextualize things that would, you know, just I'm just thinking of stories. I'm thinking of narratives. I'm thinking of ways, if a museum's job is to make relevant to its audiences the materials that it has collected and curates, are there ways like that to include more?
There are, to a certain point, ways to connect us with certain universities that are close to us. WPI and Becker College would be, and the School of Pharmacy. They would be likely to walk. Normally, Worcester is not a walking city, as opposed to Boston. So maybe there's something to think about with cars. Well, I don't know what kind of device that would be.
Right. And it wouldn't encourage automobile accidents.
Yes. But I think what is so exciting right now, and for that reason, what I told you was maybe not as structured as what you expected. We're at a time of incredible change. And this incredible change, I mean, you never change because you want to. You change because there's the need for it. And some people are then more excited about that need than others. Those who are more excited are the ones who didn't benefit that much from the status quo. But this change is not affecting the big guys, the Met, the MFA. It affects the small guys. And it affects cities that are transforming much more radically than Boston would. Boston, for the next 50 years at least, will always be Boston. Kind of economy will change, but Worcester changes much more radically. Worcester was a city that could afford to be inward-looking, and now it's part of an agglomeration of 5-6 million people all around Boston. The question for Worcester is, are we becoming part of a polycentric system, or are we going to become a dorm city that ultimately is in the exurbs? What role in that context does a cultural institution play? Does a museum play? How does that museum become an agent of supporting life quality, because it's about that, and giving people a sense of belonging and a sense of place. So and that's quite exciting. It's daunting because nothing that was constructed in the tradition of museums helps us do that. We have to invent a huge amount.
Right.
But on the other hand, it's quite exciting to be able, without safety net, however, to be able to think about that.
Right. Well, this is. I'm very happy that you've come in our sequence at the point that you have. The last lecture we had actually was one I gave on the evolution of memorials from antiquity to Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and how that just changed everything, and it's forever altered. Little did we know when that happened that perhaps she was showing us a scale of change that was going to occur in all kinds of cultural activities in just a few years, but we didn't know it. Because this movement towards experience, which clearly you are all in for Worcester, whether it's because of circumstance or intention, whether it's environment or intention, in a way doesn't matter. If it has to happen, it has to happen. And I think it's a really interesting common thread that there's these young people are all designing experiences, analyzing experiences, trying to understand experiences, and so are you, and so am I in higher education, trying to understand how to shape these experiences and how to integrate them with stories that are edifying. And it's a moving target. Because we haven't even really talked at all about the content of your collection or your, sort of curatorial, aside from the integration of the armor, which looks great and interesting, and I want to definitely go see it. But we've been having this entire conversation without talking about. So what are the areas of strength of Worcester, and we should just have a little bit of a conversation about that.
Sure. So the Worcester Art Museum has two strengths now that nobody in the area has. One is the mosaics that we have in our collection from an excavation campaign in Antioch, which is in the Middle East. The Worcester Art Museum was pairing up with the Louvre, Princeton, and Baltimore to do excavations, and we got the biggest part from that excavation campaign.
Wow.
So that is a strength that no other museum in this country has. Arms and Armor is the other one. Our collection of American art, and again, that's a very complicated notion, the national subdivision of this. So we have a relatively small collection compared to that of the MFA, but iconic works like the Freak family, which is the first portrait in America. So it's things like that. Our Old Master collection has quite some highlights. The Worcester Art Museum was the first museum to collect photography as an art form. 1904 was the first museum to show paintings by Monet and to buy works by Monet. That was in 1910. Wow. We are the first museum to buy a Gauguin, and we have our Gauguin, The Brooding Woman, is from 1891, which is when he left for good for Oceania. So there are lots of high points, but on a small scale. And what that does, as opposed to big collections with depth, that due to the sheer neighborhood of collections and high points, you connect dots that you normally wouldn't connect. And that's part of the narrative that I'm after, that we are creating, we're getting out of the silos of this gallery is just for this and for that, but also creating neighborhoods of galleries that when you go from one gallery to the next, you think, oh my God, I never thought about, just think about, I'm just making this up right now, but just think about pre-Columbian terracottas next to terracottas from European antiquity. Well, the material is the same, the techniques were different. They didn't have the wheel to throw a pot in the Americas. But then there are certain ornaments that are recurrent in Europe and in the Americas. And then it gets you to this Jungian idea. Carl Gustav Jung, psychoanalyst, competitor of Sigmund Freud, that we are actually all swimming on a gigantic ocean of collective subconscious.
Right.
And that our identity are just these little bubbles on that surface, but we're sharing a dream of forms. So you could create a Jungian museum on one level. You could introduce, which you could never do out of scale and other reasons, in the big museum, you could say, let's make the next year the year of the superheroes. And then you have Batman, whom we have in our Arms and Armor exhibition, and then Batman, Catwoman, and all these other popular heroes of the 20th and 21st century, and then think about how these superheroes, how they were defined in medieval times. Well, the superheroes in medieval times were saints that endured pain.
Right.
It's a very different superhero. But then you go to the superheroes of antiquity, and they're almost a one-to-one match. So you can look at the entire collection from that viewpoint.
Wow.
So there's so many ways that you can talk about the art that we have and make it and create stories and allow people then maybe to create their own stories via the web and other things.
Well, this is so interesting because at the MFA, which I go to all the time, the Art of the Americas wing is really smart in this way, it seems to me. Not only is that whole redevelopment of the museum a massive architectural accomplishment, but there's really a curatorial intention in the way they juxtapose art of all of the Americas that is really, I think, well, very noticeable and meaningful, I think. Well, I think with that, I think we can bring this to an end. Thank you so much for being our guest.